She didn't slam the door. That would have made it easier to hate her. No, she just stood there with her arms crossed and said, "It's not your home anymore." Then she turned, walked inside, and shut the door like it was nothing. Like I was nothing. My suitcase sat right at my feet, neatly zipped like someone had taken their time. My scarf was draped over the handle, the one he bought me years ago when the wind bothered my neck. That wind was back now, brushing against my cheeks, cold and quiet. I didn't knock. I didn't ask why. I didn't beg to stay. Because the only thing louder than the silence of that closed door was the thought that my son was still in a coma. And this was what his wife chose to do while he lay hooked to machines. I just stood there, staring at a house I once helped pay for, a home I once held together with casseroles and care. I stood there for a moment longer, not because I was waiting for her to change her mind, but because part of me needed to memorize what betrayal looks like when it's dressed in calm and tied with ribbon. Then I turned, and I walked away. Hello there, and thank you for being here. Where are you watching from tonight? I always like to know who's listening, especially when the story I'm about to share carries this much weight. If you've ever been quietly pushed aside, no shouting, no name-calling, just a slow fade like you were never needed to begin with, then I hope you stay with me. Because that night, standing outside with my suitcase in hand, I realized something. Sometimes they won't scream you out of the room. They'll just erase you with a smile. And if they've ever done that to you, I think you'll understand what comes next. My name doesn't matter as much as what I've lived through. And I've lived through enough to know when someone's smile means they've already decided you're in the way. I've never been loud, never been one to push myself into conversations or chase attention. I was raised to show up, do my part, and let others take the credit if that's what made peace easier to keep. I was married once to a man who didn't always have a lot to give, but he gave what he could, and we built something quiet and honest. He passed on before he could see the world turn cold in the ways it has, but I remember how we held each other through lean seasons and made do with less. I worked cleaning houses when I was younger. Long hours, aching knees, and hands that stayed dry no matter how much lotion I used. I didn't complain. I just folded my paychecks into the bills, paid down what I could, and prayed that my son would grow into a life better than the one I had. And he did. He worked hard, made a name for himself, married someone smart. When they were starting out, they struggled, like most young couples do. They didn't ask for help, but I gave it anyway, quietly. The kind of help you don't need to advertise. Half the mortgage, every month. Grocery deliveries, utility bills that never showed up late. I didn't want their gratitude. I didn't need to be praised or included. I just wanted them to feel stable, to have space to grow, and to know they could lean on me if things ever got heavy. But I started noticing, over time, how my presence didn't sit well with her. The sideways looks when I answered a question too quickly. The way she'd pause before telling me the simplest updates. I brushed it off, convinced myself I was overthinking. That maybe it was just stress, or the weight of raising a family. I didn't want to believe that someone could resent quiet help, that someone could see love as interference. But now, looking back, I realize she didn't want me to be a part of their foundation. She wanted me to disappear from it entirely. It was raining that morning. The kind of steady, gray rain that taps on your window like it's trying to deliver bad news gently. I remember I was folding towels when the phone rang, and something in me knew before I picked it up that it wasn't going to be good. Her voice was tight, rushed. She said he'd been in an accident, that he was on his way to the hospital, and they didn't know much yet. I didn't ask for details. I didn't even hang up properly. I set the phone down without thinking, and within minutes I was putting on the wrong shoes. I left the house with my sweater half buttoned, bag half packed, but none of that mattered. They told me he might not wake up. Just like that. A few words from a doctor I'd never met before, and the floor under my feet stopped feeling solid. I didn't cry. I couldn't. I just sat down in the nearest chair and stared at the wall until the nurse called my name again. I walked into that room and saw him lying there, tubes and wires, skin too pale for someone who'd always had so much color in his cheeks. I reached for his hand and held it gently, afraid I'd break something, but more afraid to let go. I stayed there. I didn't move much, didn't speak unless the nurses asked me something. I just watched. Every breath that machine helped him take, I counted. Every beep, every flicker on the screen, I memorized them all. It was the kind of waiting that turns hours into days and days into something heavier than time. His wife was there, too. She made calls, paced the hallway, updated people on the phone. She knew what to say, how to say it, always sounding calm and composed. She brought coffee for the nurses, took messages from relatives, and yet something didn't feel right. She looked the part, yes, but there was no softness, no stillness. She never touched his hand, never leaned in to whisper anything. Her eyes moved, but they didn't rest on him. I noticed it, but I didn't say a word. Because when you're praying that someone you love will live, you try not to stir any dust. You tell yourself it's just grief, just shock, just stress. But in my heart, a quiet alarm had already started ringing, and I knew, even before the worst came, that something deeper was about to break. On the second night, I hadn't planned to stay late. My back was aching from the waiting room chairs, and I'd only packed enough clothes for one day, but I couldn't leave. I told myself I'd rest when he was better, not before. So I stayed near his door, quiet and still, just watching him breathe with the help of those machines. The hallway lights were dim, and the noise of the hospital had settled into that soft, tired rhythm it gets late at night. I had stepped just outside his room to stretch my legs when I heard them. Voices down the corridor, just around the corner near the vending machines. I recognized hers right away. You know how some voices change when they think no one's listening? Hers did. Calm, polite, patient when others were around. But this version of her voice, it was clipped, sharp, certain. "She's old," she said, low but clear. "She's too involved. It's stressing me out. We need space." Another voice, probably a nurse, responded gently. "She's been helpful. She hasn't gotten in the way." And then came the words that stopped my breath. "We didn't ask for help. Not I, not me. We," as if my son, still unconscious, had somehow joined in the decision to erase me. I didn't move. I stood right there against the wall, heart heavy but hands steady, because in that moment, I knew it wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't grief talking. It wasn't her being overwhelmed. It was a plan, a quiet, careful one. She wanted me out. Not tomorrow. Not later. Soon. I had always told myself that kindness would earn me grace, that showing up, staying quiet, supporting from the shadows would mean I'd always be welcome. But listening to her that night, I realized I had mistaken tolerance for love. She never wanted me there. She only let me stay because it was useful. And now that it wasn't, she was ready to make me disappear. I didn't confront her. I didn't interrupt. I simply walked back into his room, sat down by his side, and watched his chest rise and fall. I whispered nothing. I prayed nothing. I just listened. To the machines, to the silence between them, and to the echo of her words still ringing in my ears. The next morning, everything felt slightly different. But not in a way most people would notice. The nurse who'd smiled at me the day before didn't make eye contact as she passed by. She didn't stop to give me any updates, didn't mention the doctor's rounds or ask how I was holding up. It was small, quiet, but noticeable, like a window that's been shut just enough to change the air in the room. I brushed it off at first, thinking maybe it was just the shift change or the weight of too many patients. But then I looked at the clipboard outside his room, the one where visitors' names were written, and mine was gone. It used to be right there, under hers. Now it was just her name, and the note beside it said primary contact. I didn't say a word. I didn't cause a scene or ask why. I just stood there, reading those two words over and over again. Primary contact, as if my presence was now optional. As if the woman who carried him, who raised him, who stayed up through his fevers and packed his school lunches and prayed through every hard season, was now just someone lingering too close. And she, well, she had stepped fully into the role. She answered questions from the nurses, signed off on forms, made decisions like she'd always done it alone. She wore composure like a badge, nodding politely at me in passing, always in control. I saw how they responded to her, how the staff deferred to her now. And I realized then that she had done what she always wanted. She had made herself the voice of the family. Not because I couldn't speak, but because I hadn't. She wore my silence like a gift, and when I said nothing, she called it agreement. I had stayed quiet to keep the peace. I had told myself that if I didn't argue, didn't challenge, didn't step on her toes, I would be allowed to stay close to him. That somehow, silence would earn me a seat, even if it wasn't front and center. But silence, I learned that morning, isn't always seen as patience or grace. Sometimes it's mistaken for surrender. And the freeze didn't happen all at once. It crept in slow. Nurses who once made small talk now kept their eyes on the chart. Questions I used to be asked now went straight to her. My chair by his bed, the one I'd claimed without claiming, was nudged just a little farther from the monitors. She didn't have to push me out loudly. She didn't have to point or raise her voice. All she had to do was act like I wasn't necessary. And in that space, others began to believe it too. I sat there through it all. Not because I didn't feel the sting, but because I loved him more than I hated what was happening. I stayed in that quiet, cold room and held on to the only thing I had left, my place in his story, even if no one else could see it. I left the hospital that afternoon only because I had to. I hadn't slept in 2 nights, and the clothes I was wearing didn't even smell like me anymore. I told her I'd just be gone for an hour, long enough to shower, grab clean clothes, maybe make a quick sandwich. She didn't say much in return, just nodded and looked back down at her phone. I didn't expect a warm goodbye, but I didn't expect what was waiting for me either. The air felt heavy when I stepped out of the cab. Not just from the weather, but from something I couldn't name yet. I walked up to the front door, same house I'd helped them move into, same steps I'd climbed with grocery bags and birthday gifts and stacks of folded laundry. I reached into my bag, found my key, and slid it into the lock without thinking. But it didn't turn. I pulled it out, looked at it like it had changed on its own, and tried again. Still nothing. The lock had been changed. For a moment I just stood there, hands still on the knob, unsure whether to laugh or cry or fall silent again. That's when I saw it. A single sheet of paper folded and tucked beneath the mat. I picked it up, opened it slowly, and read words I'll never forget. "We appreciate your help, but this isn't your home anymore." No signature, no explanation. Just that sentence, written in neat handwriting, like it was meant to sound polite. Like they were doing me a favor. I didn't knock. I didn't bang on the door or shout through the window. I didn't even cry. I looked at the house, at the curtains I helped hem, at the shrubs I planted 2 springs ago, at the mailbox I painted with my grandson's initials, and I stepped back. Because while she was busy erasing me from the front door, she forgot one very important thing. My name was still on the deed. And the mortgage? Still partly mine. She hadn't paid the bills alone. She hadn't covered the down payment alone. She hadn't built that home with just her sweat. I had been there from the beginning, silently, yes, but consistently. So I didn't see that locked door as an end. I saw it as a beginning. Because if she was going to treat me like I didn't belong, then I would stop pretending she did everything right. If she wanted space, she would have it. But it wouldn't come without cost. I folded the note again, slipped it into my bag, and walked away. Not with shame, not with heartbreak, but with something far stronger than either: clarity. The kind that doesn't need to announce itself, only act when the time is right. I didn't go back to the hospital right away. I needed time not just to rest, but to think clearly. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at that note over and over again, reading the same line until the paper felt warm in my hand. I wasn't angry in the way people expect you to be when they shut you out. I didn't want to scream or curse or cause a scene. I was past that. What I wanted now was simple: truth and peace. The kind you don't get by being silent forever. So look for a way to get into the house through the back door. With the help of few neighbors, I opened the drawer next to my bed, the one no one ever thought to check, and pulled out a folder. It was old, but well kept. Inside were receipts, printed emails, photocopies of checks, and notarized documents. I had never shown them to anyone. I never felt the need to prove what I'd done. I just wanted to help quietly. But now, that quiet was being used against me. And it was time to stop pretending it didn't matter. That house they lived in, the one I was suddenly no longer welcome in, almost slipped away from them once. Years ago, when he lost his job and she was still trying to start a business, they were behind on the mortgage. She was scared, and he didn't know how to tell me. But I found out, and I stepped in. I paid off the overdue balance, co-signed the refinance papers, and covered a portion of the new payments, month after month, while they got back on their feet. No one outside the family ever knew. I didn't need the credit, I didn't want praise. I just wanted my son and his family to feel safe. And I had the paperwork to prove it all. I made one phone call. No tears, no explanation. I simply told the woman at the law office my name and said I needed someone to review a property matter. She gave me an appointment the next morning. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was nervous, but because my heart felt strangely calm. Like a door had opened inside me that had been locked for years. When I walked into that office, I wasn't dressed to impress. I didn't carry anything fancy. Just that folder, thick with every page of every sacrifice they had quietly folded into their comfort. I sat across from a woman with gray in her hair and steadiness in her eyes, and I laid the folder on her desk. She flipped through the pages slowly. She didn't rush. And with every turn I watched her expression change, not with shock, but with respect. She didn't say much until the end. Then she looked up and asked, "Has your name ever been removed from the title?" I shook my head. "Never." She nodded once, closed the folder and said, "Then you have more rights than they think you do." I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just exhaled. Because all this time, they thought my silence meant I had no ground to stand on. But I wasn't silent because I was weak. I was silent because I believed in grace. And now I was ready to speak. Not with anger, but with truth, with proof, with a voice backed by every sacrifice I never made them ask for. I returned to the hospital 2 days later, not because I was welcome back, but because I needed to see him. I needed to look at his face and hear the sound of his breathing again. Even with all that had happened, that need hadn't left me. It had only grown heavier. I walked through those sliding glass doors with my head held steady, my steps slow and deliberate. The woman at the front desk didn't recognize me. I gave his name and waited as she scanned the system. Her eyes flicked back to mine and she said, in the politest tone she could muster, that I wasn't on the list of approved visitors anymore. I already knew it in my gut. Still, hearing it out loud felt like being erased twice. I thanked her softly and turned around without a scene. I walked down the hallway, not toward his room, but toward the nurse's station, hoping one of them might still remember who I was. And then I saw her, a young nurse I'd spoken to during those early days, the one with kind eyes who used to offer me tea when the waiting stretched too long. She looked up and froze for just a second before giving me a soft nod. I didn't speak. I didn't want to get her in trouble, but she reached for a file, pretended to check something, and leaned in just slightly. "He asks for you in his sleep," she whispered. I couldn't hold it in. My eyes filled instantly. I turned away before the tears could fall too hard. That simple sentence cut deeper than everything else. Because even sedated, even in that in-between place where the body rests but the spirit still stirs, he was looking for me. He didn't know about the door that was closed, or the lock that was changed, or the note that told me I no longer belonged. In his unconscious state, he still reached for the one person who had never walked away from him. And yet, there I stood, blocked out by someone who claimed to love him while he slept through it all. I didn't argue. I didn't ask her to break rules or go against what had been ordered. I simply reached into my bag and pulled out a card, my name, my number, and a quiet request on the back. I handed it to her gently, looking her in the eyes the way you do when you're trusting someone with something fragile. "If he wakes up," I said, "and he asks again, please let him know I was here. And that I never stopped being here." She nodded, nothing dramatic, nothing loud, just a nod filled with understanding. I walked back out the way I came, tears drying against my cheeks, heart both broken and full. Because even though I couldn't sit beside him, he had reached for me in the only way he still could. And now, someone else knew. Someone else saw. And that meant I hadn't vanished completely. Not yet. The call came early in the morning, just after sunrise, when the light was still soft and quiet. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping lukewarm tea, eyes still puffy from the kind of sleep that doesn't rest the heart. The phone rang once, then again, and I let it sit a moment longer than usual before picking it up. I didn't recognize the number, but something in me knew to answer. The voice on the other end was calm, gentle, but carried that urgency that makes your hands tremble before your ears even understand. She said, "He's awake, and he's asking for you." I didn't speak. I just stood, heart pounding, breath catching in my throat. I grabbed my bag, slipped on my shoes, and walked out the door like I was still dreaming. The drive to the hospital blurred past me. I don't remember the traffic lights, or the buildings, or the faces outside the window. I just remember clutching that same folder in my lap, not because I needed it for that moment, but because it reminded me of the fight I had quietly carried for him. When I walked through those hospital doors, something felt different. The air was warmer, and the heaviness that had hung in the halls just days ago had softened. At the desk, the same nurse from before looked up and smiled, not the way strangers do, but the way someone does when they've been waiting to see you get your turn. I gave his name. She didn't ask for ID. She just said, "We never took you off the list." She tried, but we didn't. I blinked, not quite sure I'd heard her right, and then she added, even softer, "We knew better." The elevator ride felt like a lifetime. My hands were trembling now, not from fear, but from something deeper. Relief, maybe, or the weight of all the days I'd held myself together when no one else seemed to think I mattered. When I stepped into his room, he was sitting up slightly, eyes half open, face pale but real and alive. The machines still hummed softly around him, but he wasn't lost in them anymore. He was there. And the moment he saw me, his lips parted just enough for the words I didn't know I needed. "Where have you been, Ma?" I couldn't breathe. I walked to him, slowly, and took his hand, still warm, still his. Before I could speak, she stepped forward from the corner of the room. She had been sitting there, I hadn't even noticed. She opened her mouth, probably ready to explain something, to smooth it over, to twist the past few days into something palatable. But I didn't give her the chance. I turned back to him, squeezed his fingers gently, and whispered, "It's a long story." He smiled, tired but clear, and closed his eyes for a moment. I didn't let go. Not then, not again. Because no matter what anyone else had tried to rewrite in my absence, the truth was still here, breathing, reaching for me, holding my hand like he'd never stopped. And in that moment, the ache inside me finally had a place to rest. A few days after that moment in the hospital, when I finally saw his eyes open and heard his voice again, I got another call. This time, it was my lawyer. Her voice was calm, professional, the kind of tone that lets you know everything's already in motion. She said the paperwork was ready, that the documents had been reviewed, signed, and were now being delivered. Everything I had kept tucked away in drawers and folders, every quiet payment I had made, every form with my name printed clearly and legally, was now being used for exactly what it was meant to do: protect what was mine and defend the truth. The lawyer reminded me again what I already knew. My name was still on the deed. My contributions had never been removed or overwritten. And every medical decision that had been made while he was unconscious, every form she signed pretending to speak for both of them, had no ground if challenged by someone with equal ownership. So I let the papers go. I didn't call ahead to warn anyone. I didn't show up to explain. I simply allowed the truth to arrive the way lies fear most, on paper, with proof. When the documents were served, I wasn't in the room. I didn't need to be. But I heard about it later from someone who had no reason to lie. She had been sitting at the hospital, dressed in her best, pretending everything was as it should be. And then the envelope came, delivered directly into her hands by someone who didn't flinch when she hesitated to take it. She opened it, slowly at first, then faster once she realized what it was. Mortgage records, cosigner agreements, bank statements with my name right beside theirs, and a challenge to the medical power of attorney she had assumed belonged to her alone. And in front of the staff, in front of a doctor and a nurse who had seen too much to pretend surprise, she let out a little gasp and said, "I didn't know." But that wasn't the truth. Not really. The truth is, she didn't ask. She never asked how the bills stayed current during the lean years. She never asked how the mortgage got approved again after their first default. She never asked where the grocery cards came from, or why the electricity never got shut off. She accepted the comfort but denied the hands that carried it. So when I finally saw her later that day, standing outside his room, arms crossed, like she was still in charge of something. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't smile either. I simply looked her in the eye, steady and unflinching, and said, "You didn't ask." That was all. No threats, no explanation, just the one sentence that carried every truth she had tried to avoid. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can say to someone who's buried you in silence is that you were never gone. You were just waiting. Patiently, quietly, for the right moment to speak. And when you finally do, it doesn't sound like anger. It sounds like justice. I never moved back into that house. Not because I couldn't, and not because I wasn't entitled to, but because I no longer needed to. That house had changed. The air inside it had shifted. And no matter how many times you wash the floors or open the windows, some silences still cling to the walls. I had my name on the deed, my hands in the foundation, and my love in every corner, but even so, I knew when it was time to let go. Instead of fighting for space in a place that no longer felt like mine, I made another quiet decision. I called the lawyer one last time and told her I wanted to sell my share. She hesitated, asked if I was sure. I told her yes, but not just sell. I told her I wanted my portion handed directly to my son. Not to her, not through her, to him. The man I raised, the one who had called for me even in his sleep, the one who never asked me to disappear. I wanted him to have what I helped build, without conditions, without noise. Not because he demanded it, but because I had already given it in my heart. I signed the papers the next week, quietly, no announcement, no audience. I let go of the bricks, but not the memories. I walked away with nothing loud or bitter, just a final choice, clean and clear. And then I disappeared from the drama. No final word, no last warning, just distance. Not out of fear, not out of defeat, but out of clarity. I bought a small home just outside of town, tucked beneath tall trees with enough space for quiet mornings and soft evenings. I filled it with the things I loved, my books, my old recipes, photos in wooden frames, and a garden that didn't ask for much more than time and patience. I tended to it slowly. I watered what needed care and let the rest grow wild. And in that space I found peace. Not the kind you see in postcards, not the kind wrapped in smiles and warm hugs and perfect endings. No, this peace was quieter, sharper. The kind that comes when you finally understand your worth has nothing to do with how others receive you. Peace isn't always pretty. Sometimes it's knowing you could have set fire to everything that hurt you, and choosing not to. It's watching the match burn in your hand and dropping it in water instead of on the floor. It's knowing you had the power to break what tried to break you, and walking away without leaving ash behind. I still check on him, from a distance. He calls sometimes, visits when he can. We don't talk about what happened, not directly. But in the quiet pauses when he squeezes my hand before he leaves, I know he remembers. I know he understands, and that's enough, because healing doesn't always come wrapped in reconciliation. Sometimes it comes in solitude, in soil, in silence that you choose. Not the kind forced on you by others, but the kind you make for yourself, where nothing grows but peace. If they ever looked you in the eye and made you feel like you didn't matter, like your presence was too much, like your love was a burden they never asked for, remember this. Your worth isn't tied to their permission. You don't have to prove yourself to people who already decided not to see you. You don't have to shrink just to make space for their comfort. I told this story because I know someone out there has lived their own version of it. And if you have, I want to hear from you. Tell your truth below. Write it in your own words. Don't hold it in. Let someone else see the strength you carried. And if you've ever carried more than they gave you credit for, if you've ever been called too much or not enough in the same breath, subscribe, stay with me. Because there's still space here for your voice, even if they never made room for it before. Thank you for watching. See you on the next video.